Surrender always has a price. Commitment comes with sacrifice.
Okay, so we are discussing now Lucifer's desire to exalt his throne. So we've seen that Lucifer's rebellion had all to do with rejecting the law of God, the law of agape love. And so a rejection of agape love meant that the principle that he introduced had to be diametrically opposed to grace, which is freely given in agape love, right? So what happens if you remove grace? What's the natural consequence if you take away grace?
Yeah.
No love.
No love.
Eventually death.
And death, okay. But now what you have is a system of either deserving or not deserving.
Yeah.
Because grace is impartial and unconditional. It's not conditional on your works or lack of works. And so now you have to either deserve something or not deserve it, right?
It's salvation by works now.
It's salvation by works now.
Mm-hmm.
So now, with Lucifer's new principle, one had to earn their way to God. And isn't that what Esau did, right?
Mm-hmm.
He was trying to earn it with the fruits of his labor, right? And earn their way to heaven. One has, I'm sorry, I didn't mean Esau, I meant Cain. That's what Cain did.
Yes, the first
Yes, yeah.
And that's who I was thinking of when you said that too, so.
Yes, it was Cain, yeah. One has to do something for it, thus one has to deserve it, okay? So now, good works earn points, and evil works lose points, and that transfers into a reward and punishment system. So, here is the crux of the matter in terms of Lucifer's pride. Iniquity is focused not only on what I can do, but what I can do better than others. Reminds me of that musical. Anything you can do, I can do better.
Yes.
Right? Okay, so this system is the source of competition and pride, which results in selfishness, right? Yes. If we have a competition, you're trying to get above everybody else, that's selfishness. The system itself is the root of Satan's pride and self-exaltation. So it was by the sheer nature of his own moral law that Lucifer became proud and selfish. Okay? So if God's agape love is unconditional, iniquity has to be conditional, if it's the opposite. And if God's agape love is impartial, iniquity has to be partial. And if God's agape love is selfless, iniquity has to be selfish. And so the moment Lucifer removed God's unconditional and impartial love as the rule of law for the universe, he introduced an arbitrary system imposed by an arbitrary ruler who was himself. Okay?
Would you repeat that list of how iniquity is opposed to
Yes.
agape?
If agape love is unconditional, iniquity being its absolute opposite, iniquity is conditional. It's conditional on our behavior. If agape love is impartial, iniquity has to be partial. And if agape love is selfless, then iniquity has to be selfish. Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, okay, can I say something?
Sure.
Even though, so when I gave my life to Yeshua, and then I know that the Father's love is unconditional, but then, I had, so I was growing and growing and growing, right,
Right.
to His light. But then So, okay, so how do I deal with the sin? And is there a limit? So I say, so when do I stop turning myself away from the person? Do I give that? Because I think I stopped. Okay, so does the Father has a limit? That was the battle of my mind. You know, when do I turn away from that person?
Well, the Father doesn't have a limit.
That's what. See, this solves the problem. Yeah.
Hallelujah.
But the Father gives you freedom. But the Father gives you freedom.
Yeah.
And though, you know, He will never force Himself on you. And so if you want to turn away, He will let you do it.
And one thing we must consider in the light of what you have just brought up, God never is an enabler. God will never enable you to continue being in sin. He will deliver you from it. He will do everything to woo you out of it. But He will never be there to enable you to continue in that direction. And that is something that must be clearly understood. Let's say like the prodigal son is a very good example, okay? God gave him the freedom. He loved that boy unconditionally, but the boy wanted his freedom. God, the Father, gave him his freedom. Then when he's in the pig pen, his brain kicks in and he thinks what God is like. How? Because he saw what God did to the servants, how God dealt with the servants. And I'm positive that some of the servants must have been problematic too. But how the Father dealt with those servants awakened in his mind what his Father is like. And on those bases he came to the Father. But the Father was never an enabler. He gave him whatever he wanted, what was his inheritance, and allowed him to go his way. But he was always there waiting and wooing him to come back.
Okay, so I'm trying to show the consequences of going away from agape love. Okay? Removing, if agape love is unconditional, then iniquity has to be conditional. If agape love is impartial, iniquity has to be partial. So the moment Lucifer removed God's unconditional and impartial love as the rule of law for the universe, or the moment he tried to remove that and create a new law as opposed to agape, he introduced an arbitrary system imposed by an arbitrary ruler, because agape is blanket, it covers everybody. But now Lucifer was going to deal with each situation arbitrarily, right? Every case was going to be different. No more blanket grace over everybody. So the moment that he introduced this arbitrary way of thinking, he created force, violence. And the result was the removal of freedom. Okay? So he created conditions, and the moment he created conditions, he also created hierarchy. If one meets certain conditions, he will attain certain privileges. Or conversely, if one doesn't meet certain criteria, he will suffer certain punishments. So iniquity created a pyramid, a scale of merit based on the balances of good and evil. If you're good, you're going to go up the ladder. If you're evil, you're going to go down the ladder. There's no more blanket grace over everything. So this is the foundation for all hierarchies and religions that are based on works. The moment Lucifer created hierarchy, of course, pride comes in. Because if you're higher than everybody else, look at me, I'm better, right? So, now, the moment that Lucifer introduced this new law, this new moral law, and also the angels that followed him, that moment he acquired a dual character of good and evil. And so now him and his followers vacillated back and forth between two apparent polar opposites. Apparent polar, they seem to be polar opposites of good and evil. So a dual character is the inevitable consequence of this rebellion against God. And we know this from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That tree was in the garden. God put that for us to understand these things. So, some people may say, well, how do you come to these conclusions? Well, we look at Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, and many other places in the Bible, and then we look at the garden. There's a tree there with a duality of good and evil. The duality is clear and apparent in that tree. So, Lucifer and all his followers no longer have an entire perfect character, like we saw the word perfect in Ezekiel 28. They're all two-faced and schizoid to certain degrees. That means all of us have a certain degree of schizophrenia, right? Yes, we're good and we are evil. So pride is also the inevitable condition of anyone who is controlled by Lucifer's moral law of reward and punishment. And we saw that in the Pharisees. They were always trying to earn the favor of heaven by their works, and they wanted the highest places and to be seen by everybody. So there is no escaping that outside of Jesus Christ, outside of his principle of unconditional love. So only Jesus and his teachings can save us from this evil law residing in our hearts. Jesus' instruction was to do our good works in secret, not to seek worldly recognition. And that's eye-opening because it reveals just how far removed from iniquity God's principles are. Okay? Lucifer's desire, on the other hand, was to ascend into heaven. And that was the first instance of self-exaltation, pride, and self-seeking. So this began the institution of a hierarchy based on merit, demerit, with him the heaven's brightest angel. And here is the onset of the survival of the fittest, right? Only the highest survive. There's only one winner in this race, one gold medalist, right? And any means in this system, any means to become that number one can be used. I mean, you can step on other people's heads to get to the top, right? If it were possible, Lucifer would have destroyed God, even God, without a second thought, so that he could have that position, and so that he could have no opposition in becoming the one and only monarch of the universe. Why do we say that? Because inherent in this new law that he created, there's only room for one at the top. There's only room for one. And isn't that exactly what he attempted to do when he killed Jesus Christ? He tried to kill his competition, right? A merit-based system of government promotes self-exaltation and breeds hierarchy. And pride is embedded in hierarchy. But now hierarchy produces, and I got this, I did a search on Ellen White on the word hierarchy. And I took all the things that she said that hierarchy does, and this is the list. It produces power, pride, covetousness, ambition, deception, corruption, profligacy, fear, greed, rage, bigotry, and malice. That's what hierarchy does. Now we know that all of these things are opposed to the fruits of the Spirit, right? Hierarchy forces people into submission, and thus it removes their freedom of conscience.
Could you repeat that? Power, pride,
Okay.
righteousness,
Yes.
ambition.
Power. Satan's hierarchy produces power, pride, covetousness, ambition, deception.
What was that?
Ambition, deception, corruption, profligacy.
What's profligacy?
I was just thinking of that myself. I don't know. I have to look it up. Do you know what it means? I told you I picked
Excess,
the
maybe?
excess. Could be.
Maybe, I'm not quite sure, but
Could
something,
be.
could be something like
Does
that.
anybody have a dictionary?
What did you say?
Excess.
Profligacy, yes.
Profligacy
Excess in
is
the
like
wrong way.
excess.
Mm-hmm.
Excess in the wrong way.
Yeah, yeah.
Extravagant?
Extravagance maybe
Okay.
is certainly in a bad way.
Yes. Okay. Fear, greed, rage, bigotry, and malice. And I like all of these are opposed to the fruits of the Spirit.
Mhm.
So hierarchy forces people into submission, thus removing freedom of conscience. The moment you force people into submission, you remove their freedom of conscience,
Yeah.
because now you've become their master. It uses fraud and forgery. And this is interesting. In order to even accomplish very high ideals. Okay? That's the deception of good and evil. It uses fraud and forgery in order to accomplish even so-called high ideals. And stops at nothing to achieve its goals. It even resorts to cruelty and murder. And we've seen this in corrupt governments and corrupt religions. Many times in the name of a greater good. Okay? As in the case of Caiaphas' verdict. It is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish. Okay? That's using murder and cruelty in the name of a greater good. And we're going to see this played out at the end time, big time. Okay? In fact, that's how Satan operates. He focuses on the greater good. He focuses on a good thing, and anybody that goes against it become the enemies of the greater good, and then they're persecuted and they're punished.
And we see that in the
Mhm.
world.
Yes.
Mhm.
And we have to be careful that we don't join those things.
Mhm.
Even if it's against terrorists, that we don't join the movement that is just, we have to have the grace of God towards impartially and unconditionally, and that's the saving knowledge that will affect a person's life and take them away from the evil that they're doing.
Amen.
When Jesus said that the devil was a liar and a murderer from the beginning, in John 8:44, he was referring to the moral law Lucifer had authored in heaven. E.G. White says the following about Lucifer and his desire for power. Lucifer desired God's power, but not his character. He sought for himself the highest place, and every being who is actuated by his spirit will do the same. Thus, alienation, discord, and strife will be inevitable. Dominion becomes the price of the strongest. The kingdom of Satan is a kingdom of force. Every individual regards every other as an obstacle in the way of his own advancement, or a stepping stone on which he himself may climb to the highest place. So that is his whole system that he introduced into the universe. Satan's law is the reason why all earthly governments are plagued by widespread corruption. Characters built on merit system principles become proud, self-seeking, self-centered, and arbitrary. In this environment, it is actually the strongest, the brightest, the greediest, and the most ruthless that survive. God is so completely different from this system. He has no pride, no selfishness, and no desire to be at the top by himself. In fact, Jesus is even willing to share his throne with humanity. To him who overcomes,
This
I will
is
grant...
Revelation 3:21.
Revelation 3:21. To him who overcomes, I will grant to sit with me on my throne, as I also overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne.
Okay, so that's the difference between the two kingdoms. I mean, one of the differences. Jesus' parable of the wedding feast tells the story of a certain king, and this blew my mind when I realized this. A certain king who arranged a marriage feast for his son. And of course, this is the father arranging a marriage feast for the son and the human race, right? The story tells how the king's servants went out to invite various guests to the wedding, but how each found an excuse not to come. The parable ends with an astonishing statement. It says, therefore, and this is taken from Matthew 22, 9 to 10. Matthew 22, 9 to 10. Therefore, go into the highways, and as many as you find, invite to the wedding. So those servants went out into the highways and gathered all whom they could find, both bad and good. Okay? And the wedding hall was filled with guests. Now you see here the impartiality of God. He's inviting everybody. And the irony is that none of us are either, I mean, we're all bad in a sense. We're, all sinners. We're all bad. There is no good in us. The good that is in us comes from Satan's system of good and evil. Unless we have God's agape love in us, like Adam had before the fall. That's the difference. And so he invited what we considered good and bad. He invited all, impartially, unconditionally. And the banquet hall was filled. So what is Jesus saying here? Why would God invite both the bad and the good to his wedding feast? Isn't Jesus saying that God's love grace is unconditional and impartial? Realizing this grace, these guests were transformed. Isn't that what Jesus did when he was on earth too? Didn't he eat and drink with the bad and the good? Didn't he extend God's kingdom of mercy and grace to everyone without conditions? Satan's throne of iniquity, on the other hand, creates a ladder of worth based on a merit system obeyed a false merit. Yes?
Well, verse 12, isn't there a condition?
What's the condition?
Well, somebody got thrown out for not having on the wedding garment, so what's that?
Right.
What's the parallel
Okay.
for us?
The wedding garment, the robe of righteousness. That's the, they accepted the remission of their sins.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying? And
So
that,
you compare that also when he's talking to the Pharisees and he states that many shall sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but you yourselves will be thrust out. So how do you compare that with this?
yes, because they were working on the merit system.
Okay, so that's...
And the ones that had the robe of righteousness were working under the grace, the unconditional.
So in
Oh,
other words, that's the
so-
condition that they accepted the remission of sins.
Well, yes, it's the condition is, do you believe? Do you believe that you are pardoned unconditionally? Right? But the other ones were still working on their 600 laws to keep the Sabbath or whatever it was. They were focused on their works, and with their works they hoped to earn salvation. They were on a merit system.
And with that robe of righteousness, that would include a correct understanding of the Father's character, right?
Yes,
Also-
absolutely. And that is all involved in a correct understanding, right?
Surrender always has a price. Commitment comes with sacrifice. But when God's love gets through